Hello everyone, my name is Kitty and I'm here today to show you how to make this cottagecore inspired dress. Hopefully it's easy and you can follow along. So let's get started. The materials I used for this project include 2 white bed sheets measuring 150 by 250 centimeters, some matching white thread, elastic, and matching white cotton trim. Hopefully the pattern is very easy for you to make. I just took an A3 sized piece of tracing paper and I measured over from the top right corner 10 centimeters to the left and 19 centimeters down. Then I sort of connected those two measurements in a rounded fashion. And then from the top left corner I measured 5 centimeters down and drew a straight angled line. And from that top right corner, you can just measure 24 centimeters over, and that's going to be your sleeve. You're basically using this pattern for all the pieces, the front of your bodice, the back of your bodice, and your sleeves. In addition to your bodice and sleeve pattern, we will also be making a circle skirt. There are some really great circle skirt generators on the internet. This is just sort of the measurements I used to create mine. This circle skirt will be for a 30-inch waist, and it is about 110 centimeters long, so it's going to be almost a full-length skirt. Now, I'm not sure if you can tell, but I cut 1/2 of my circle skirt on the fold and 1/2 on the edges. That way I have 3 seams, 1 in the back and 2 on the sides. After making my first half of my circle skirt, I lay it on top of my other bed sheet, kind of as a pattern. That way I don't have to measure again and I know that they are exact. After I finished cutting out my circle skirt pieces, I used the remaining fabric to cut out my bodice and sleeves. After cutting out my bodice pieces, I fold my pattern on that red line, and now I have my sleeve pattern. And then I cut out my sleeve pieces. Since I want to make long sleeves, I'm trying to squeeze my sleeve pieces onto the remaining fabric I have. And that means I'm not able to cut my sleeves on fold, so I end up having 4 sleeve pieces. In addition, I cut a rectangle for the waistband, which is 31 inches long, and 2 rectangles 8 inches by 4 inches that will later be used for the cuffs of my sleeves. And this is what all my pieces look like cut out. Here you can see how I folded my pattern on the red line to cut my sleeves. And you can see how my bodice pieces are obviously much shorter since I wanted long sleeves. And here's a closer look at the rectangles that will be used for my cuffs and waistband. And a glimpse of my circle skirt pieces that show you how I've cut 1 on the fold and 1 not. For the bodice, we will be using an enclosed seam. Match your bodice pieces wrong sides touching and straight stitch down the side. Go ahead and repeat on both sides. On the seam, flip your bodice piece and give it another straight stitch, which will enclose that seam allowance within the seam. Now take your sleeves and straight stitch the inside of your sleeve. Fold it over and straight stitch it one more time to create an enclosed seam. You will now match the armhole of your sleeve to the armhole of your bodice, pretty sides touching. Because this seam will not be enclosed, I like to straight stitch it and give it a zigzag stitch so it won't come unraveled. I do think that because I did not cut my sleeves on the fold and instead had 4 pieces, it was easier to join the sleeve to the armhole. But at this point I went ahead and sewed the top of my sleeve together. After sewing the top of my sleeves together, I created a channel for the elastic along the top edge of my bodice. I started by zigzag stitching the top edge and then folding that edge over and straight stitching it down. I then folded that edge over and straight stitched it down, making sure there was enough room for my elastic to slip through that channel. I then decided I wanted a little trim along the top edge of my bodice. I straight stitched it down on the top and bottom of my trim just beneath the elastic channel on the top of my bodice. Now to move on and add the cuff to the bottom of your sleeve. I started by folding my rectangle in half and stitching down the sides of the rectangle and insiding it out. I went ahead and added a little trim to my cuff. I cut the trim a bit longer than my cuff, folded the edges under, and straight stitched it down along the top and bottom of the lace. I made my bodice inside out and zigzag stitch along the bottom edge of my sleeve. I then found the center of my cuff and matched that raw edge with the top seam of my bodice, pinning them together in place. I then matched the sides of my cuff to that bottom seam of my sleeve, making sure both sides of the cuff were as close as possible together. After you match the cuff and sleeve together, you can sew those two edges together, and it should be pretty sides touching. That way when you inside out your bodice, the cuff will sit nicely and the sleeve will be gathered along the cuff. I like to have the cuff fabric on top of my sewing machine and the sleeve fabric on top of the cuff fabric. I then use these small scissors to push the fabric under the foot of the sewing machine and manually create those gathers as I sew those two edges together. On my waistband, I found the center point and the quarter points and marked them with pins. I then matched the center of my waistband to the center point of my bodice and those quarter points on my waistband to the side seams on my bodice. I also matched the edges of my waistband to the edges of my bodice. I put my waistband directly on top of the sewing machine and the bodice sits on top of the waistband. Once again, I used the small scissors to push the fabric underneath the foot of the sewing machine and manually create these gathers. Because my waistband is pinned to my bodice, I'm able to estimate about how much gathers I should create between these points. Once I finished gathering the bodice along the waistband, I flipped it over and top stitched these gathers down. This, of course, is optional. I was very lucky when cutting out my circle skirt and took advantage of the finished edges of the bed sheet. So my circle skirt has edges that are already finished. So I went ahead and matched the sides of my circle skirt together and straight stitched them down. Next, I found the center point of the waistband on my bodice and matched it to the center point of my circle skirt. Then, working from the center, I matched my circle skirt all along my waistband, making sure to pin it as I went. Making sure that pretty sides were touching, I then stitched my circle skirt to my waistband. Again, top stitching is optional. Now to finish the bottom of your circle skirt with a rolled hem, and if necessary, the sides of your dress. Now to add the elastic to the top channel of your dress. My elastic was about 40 inches long, but I ended up shortening it to my preference. I added a safety pin to the front of my elastic and pushed it through the channel. After I pulled the elastic through the channel, I gave it a few stitches to hold it in place and trimmed it. I then shortened the other end of my elastic to my preference, stitched it down, and trimmed it. Okay, so full disclosure, I had intended on this being the front of the dress. But after seeing on the mannequin, I've decided that the back that I was initially going to add a closure to, I'm going to add some ties and make that the front of my dress. So in my leftover fabric, I cut some strips of fabric. I then folded those strips in half and straight stitched them down, and then using a safety pin, turned them inside out. I then used the little scissors to push the insides of the edge in and straight stitch them down. I toyed with the idea of where I wanted my ties to be and how many I wanted. Once I was certain, I pinned them in place and sewed them down, using a couple stitches so that it was reinforced. The tie front closure is optional, and you are able to finish your dress any way you want. And voila, your dress is finished.